I've studied memory for at least 4 decades, and I think we could all agree that memory is something that's pretty important to all of us. I mean, without it, we'd have to get up in the morning and figure out how to work the electric toothbrush, how to make coffee. We'd have to figure that out anew every day. And our personal memories really define who we are, with all the sadnesses and treasures that they contain. So I want to ask you this question because, as you heard in the introduction, memory is not always perfect. But do you think that I could make you remember something that never happened? Could I make you remember, for example, that as a child you found a cat stuck in a tree and rescued that cat? Do you think I could make you remember as a child you were attacked by a vicious animal? Do you think I could make you remember that as a teenager you committed a crime and it was serious enough that it brought the police to the scene? Do you think I could make you remember that maybe a week ago you cheated while playing a game and took money from the bank when you weren't supposed to? I want you to think about these questions and how you would answer them now, and I'm going to ask you again in 30 minutes. I'm usually thinking about memory in conjunction with legal cases, and so I spend a lot of time, for example, thinking about the people in our country and even other parts of the world who have been convicted of crimes that they didn't do. There's one project in New York, the Innocence Project, that has gathered data on more than 300 individuals who were convicted of crimes they didn't do. They spent 15, 20, 25 years in prison, collectively more than 4,000 years, until DNA testing proved their actual innocence. And when these cases have been analyzed, and they have been, it's been discovered that close to 3/4 of them are due. The wrongful conviction is caused by faulty memory. So I think this is a pretty nice way of motivating my students and others to want to learn something about human memory. So over the course of these many decades, I and my collaborators, graduate students, lab mates, postdocs, have developed a number of paradigms for studying memory. And one of those paradigms is now called the misinformation paradigm. So what happens here is we show people a simulated accident or a simulated crime, and then we feed them some post-event information, some misleading information about the event they actually experienced, and then we test them to see what it is they can remember. And so we've done lots of experiments where we show people these simulated accidents, and we can change their memory for the details of what happened. In an earlier study, we showed people an accident where a car went through a stop sign, and by asking a single leading question, we can get lots and lots of people to remember the car went through a yield sign instead of a stop sign. In a more recent study, we've used as subjects soldiers who are going to survival school, learning what it's going to be like if they're ever captured as prisoners of war. And we embedded some misinformation into a study with these survival school soldiers so that as part of their survival school, they undergo a 30-minute extremely hostile, aggressive interrogation. And by asking suggestive and leading questions that can suggest misinformation, we can contaminate their memory for the details. We can, for example, if they have actually been interrogated by the person on the left, we'll call him the perpetrator, we can get people to believe and remember that the person on the right was the one who actually conducted that interrogation. So it was really in around the 1990s that I began to see an altogether more extreme kind of memory problem. some people were going into therapy. Maybe they had one problem like a depression or maybe an eating disorder, and they were coming out of this therapy with another problem. Memories of severe childhood brutalization, sometimes lasting for a decade or more, sometimes memories of being forced into satanic rituals, being forced to endure animal sacrifice, baby breeding, baby sacrifice, the works. And when I started to see these cases in the public domain and to get involved as a consultant or an expert witness, it became pretty clear that in virtually all of these cases, some form of therapy was going on, and maybe that therapy had something to do with where these bizarre memories were coming from. And so what was going on in that suggestive therapy? Sometimes guided imagination, sometimes sexualized dream interpretation, occasionally hypnosis, exposing people to false information. And I began to wonder, could we bring this kind of situation into a laboratory setting where we could try to plant these really rich false memories and watch the process unfold? And in looking for a way to do this, we developed this variation on the paradigm where now there's no event to begin with, no accident, no interrogation, whatever, but we're just going to ply people with suggestions about the past, and then we'll test them to see what they remember about their childhood or about their more recent past. And our first idea was to plant a false memory that when you were 5 or 6 years old, you were lost in a shopping mall, you were frightened, crying, ultimately rescued by an elderly person and reunited with your family. And we succeeded. I won't go into the details of the methodology, but we succeeded after 3 suggestive interviews in persuading about a quarter of these ordinary, healthy men and women that they had had this completely made-up experience, either in part or whole. Other investigators came along and used our basic methodology to plant memories that would be even more unusual or bizarre. So one study in Tennessee planted a false memory that when you were a kid, you nearly drowned and had to be rescued by a lifeguard. Another study in Canada planted a false memory that you were attacked by a vicious animal or had a serious indoor or outdoor accident, succeeding with about half of their subjects. A study that I collaborated on with an Italian collaborator, we planted a false memory that when you were a child, you witnessed a person being demonically possessed. And a recent study published just a year ago, planting a false memory, a Canadian study, that you committed a crime as a teenager and it was serious enough that the police came. Last week I was in London, very proudly accepting the Maddox Prize, and I participated in a symposium with one of my academic granddaughters, Kim Wade, who gave me a paper that she is publishing. It's going to be coming out in 2017, which is a mega-analysis now of about 20 years or so of these studies of planting these really rich false memories. Her research group brought together data from more than 400 subjects, and when a common coding scheme was used to analyze, it was found that 30% of these individuals developed a kind of a rich false memory, and an additional 23% a belief that this made-up experience had actually happened. These studies use a fairly strong form of suggestion. You know, we talked to your mother, we found out some things that happened to you as a child, let's see what you can remember or don't remember. But you don't need these strong forms of suggestion. We've shown that other techniques, ones that I was seeing in some of that suggestive psychotherapy, can also lead people to develop false beliefs and false memories. So if I plant a false memory in you, does it have repercussions? Does it affect your later thoughts, your later intentions, your later behavior? We've now done a number of studies that show that these false memories do have repercussions. I can plant a false memory in you that you got sick eating eggs, you got sick eating pickles, you got sick eating strawberry ice cream, and you don't want to eat the foods as much anymore. And when we put foods in front of you that we've made you believe and remember you got sick on as a child, you don't eat as much of those foods. We can plant a warm, fuzzy memory about a healthy food, like asparagus, and people want to eat more asparagus. And actually, this is the title of one of my favorite titles of one of our scientific papers is Asparagus, a Love Story. I just think it's a great title, but I could tell you a whole lot more about this, but I get asked lots of questions about these false memories. Is there any way to distinguish a true memory from a false memory? You might think that people would be more emotional about their true memories than their false memories. But in work done with a former PhD of mine, Cara Laney, we planted false memories of things that would have been upsetting if they had happened. We got emotional reactions to those memories. We compared them to the emotional reactions of people who truly had the experiences, and those emotional ratings were very similar. Maybe the brain knows. Maybe if you could do some functional magnetic resonance imaging when people are recounting true memories or false memories, you might be able to use those neural signals as a way to discriminate true and false memories. But with my collaborators who know a whole lot about fMRI, we showed, if anything, there's just a similarity in the neural signals when people are recounting a true memory versus a false one. Is everyone susceptible to these kinds of manipulations? Or might there be a group out there who are immune? Well, we had a chance recently to study a very special group of people who have extraordinary autobiographical memories. You may have seen them on 60 Minutes. They've been studied by colleagues of mine in neurobiology at University of California, Irvine. They remember just about everything they did every day of their adult life. What would happen to these people if we put them into some of these false memory experiments? And this merging of two labs did this study. We got people with the superior memory. We compared them to age-matched controls who don't have this superior memory capability. And, I mean, this was one of those great studies because it didn't matter how it came out. It was going to be interesting. They were either going to be immune, they were going to be susceptible, they were going to be immune on some tests and not others. But the bottom line is this group was just as susceptible to these kinds of memory contamination. And one of our most recent studies shows that you don't even need a lot of deception. You can just get people to tell a story about their past. With my recent PhD, Stephen Frenda, and this is part of his dissertation work, we just got people to tell us a convincing story, just make up a story about rescuing a cat stuck in a tree. And after undergoing this exercise, many people started to believe and remember that this had actually happened to them. This manuscript doesn't have a journal title attached to it yet because, well, I guess we could say it's between rejections, but I am sure that that we're going to find a very good home for this paper at some point. So, what about the ethics? What about the ethics of the fact that with this mind technology, we can make people believe and remember all kinds of things that didn't happen. We can affect their behavior. it does raise questions about whether, if ever, we should use this mind technology, or should we think about banning its use? So let me bring you back to my initial question. Could I make you remember? Could I make you remember you rescued a cat in a tree as a child? You were attacked by a vicious animal as a child. You committed a crime as a teenager, so serious that the police came. You cheated on a game just a week ago and took money from the bank that you didn't earn. All of these things have been done in a sizable minority of experimental subjects over the last few decades. And so I will just leave you with the one take-home message. I think if I've learned anything in these decades of working on false memories, it's this: that just because somebody tells you something and they describe it with a lot of confidence and they describe it in a lot of detail and they express emotion when they tell you about it, it doesn't mean that it really happened. You need independent corroboration to know whether you're dealing with a genuine memory or something that is a product of some other process, imagination, or some other process. And such a realization might have made a difference in the case of those hundreds of people who spent all that time in prison for crimes that they didn't do based on somebody's faulty memory, because they learned this the hard way. That memory, like liberty, is a fragile thing. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good evening, everybody. That was fascinating.
Oh, thank you.
Although I must say that what I found most disturbing about it was where you talked about how media coverage could also contribute to misinformation. How could that be? Thank you. So I want to, since my introduction talks about this book that I've written about questions, I want to start with this. What are the questions that actually make me start to think that I did something or I'm remembering something that didn't happen? What do you ask?
Well, first of all, in the earlier work on the misinformation effect, we will ask a question that embeds the misinformation into a relative clause.
Like what?
So, did another car pass the red dots and while it was at the intersection with the yield sign? So if you're busy thinking, gosh, did another car pass? And I slip in this information about the yield sign, like a Trojan horse. It invades you because you're paying attention over here, and I slip it into your mind.
But you don't actually ask me, do you remember the yield sign?
Later, we come back and say, oh, did you see a yield sign? And
but that was the stop sign that now becomes a yield sign.
Exactly. So that's how a leading question can insinuate details. Let's take the food studies and fill out a whole bunch of questionnaires, your personality, your thoughts about food, all kinds of things, just to give credibility to what's going to happen a week later when you come back and we tell you, Frank, we fed all your data into our really smart computer program that determines certain things happened to you as a child, and we'd like to ask you about these things. And then maybe we'll throw out a few things that are true of most kids. You know, you dislike spinach. And then you got sick on strawberry ice cream sometime in your childhood. It's clear. And so you have to try to think about this and imagine it if you can't remember. And that's how we get the false belief or false memory planted in your mind.
So you tell me I got sick on strawberry ice cream.
Our really smart computer analyzed your data. It's called it's the false.
Well, what if I never got sick on strawberry ice cream? I'm still starting to believe that I got sick on.
Well, you might be in the 60% who say I just don't remember that and never do. But a sizable minority of people, by the time we're done with them, start to Remember this.
Let me just ask you one more, because there's one that stands out here is a little different than maybe I got sick from strawberry ice cream and I don't remember or whatever. And that is, you can convince me that I committed a crime as a teenager. Now, when you're getting down to something so personal, so direct, so bad, right? Nobody wants to say that they committed a crime as a teenager. Is that a different level? Do you have different results with that? Because that's...
Okay, yes. So that particular study was a Canadian study published in 2015, and they convinced people, as they reported in a top-ranked, high-impact journal, that they had convinced. Actually, they reported 70% of their subjects that they had committed this crime. And
Canadians?
yeah, it was done at UBC, as a matter of fact. Yeah. So that, I mean, it's one of the studies.
That's incredible.
Actually, about a year ago, we published a paper in which we got people to confess to ruining a computer that they hadn't really ruined. And if we deprived them of sleep all night, they were 4 times more likely to confess to having done this act. So we're learning a lot more about things that start to look like false confessions.
I really wish you and I had had this conversation when my children were little. But what are leading questions and what are suggestive questions? What does that sound like in some of these cases where you've been an expert witness and you've actually heard them and seen them?
Well, I'll tell you one. Fortunately, it was recorded, but the police officer takes a 6-pack, 6 photos to a witness and says, "Do you identify the bad guy?" And he says, "I don't recognize anyone." The officer actually said, "I see your eyes drifting down to number 6. Take a look." And before you know it, number 6 is identified and being prosecuted.
That easy?
Yeah.
I mean, it's that easy to plant an idea? And is there a distinction there between memory? Is that person actually remembering through that process? Or are they merely responding to a suggestion that's being planted in their brain?
Well, we do make this distinction between believing something to be true and then actually having a memory. And a memory is with the full feeling that you recall it. And usually you can probe a person and get some sense about which category they fall into.
Do you find in making these suggestions and in doing this research around false memory that this is very disconcerting and discomforting to therapists and prosecutors and people who rely essentially on memory for their living? Because what you're saying essentially is, not so fast, this may not be as reliable as we think.
That's what I'm saying, yes. That's what I'm saying, and I think we just kind of have to accept it and live with it. I mean, we accept the fact, for example, that, we might need eyeglasses, and we do, and we figure out a way to accommodate it, so let's accept this and try to figure out what we can do about it. But I think it's not just in the legal system. I think people in general feel a little uncomfortable with the idea that there could be so much fiction sprinkled in with all the facts
so much
in there.
Sprinkled in and so easily planted if it's not even there.
Right.
With a mere, some suggestive questions. I want to go to your questions and pepper those in. And so do we have mics that are wandering around, or how are we doing this, folks? The microphones, there's a standing mic here and a standing mic here. If you'll make your way, and then we'll sprinkle these in. I'd ask you, as you ask your question, identify yourself, tell us where you're from, or if you have an expertise or a research area that jives with some of this, feel free to tell us that, and then ask your question. Let's start over here, ma'am.
Hi, I'm Yael Fitzpatrick from the American Geophysical Union. And
I'm sorry, say that again?
Yael, and I challenge you to remember that. Thank you for sharing this really fascinating topic with us. I have a question about the people who served as the research subjects of your experiments. How much were they aware of the nature of the experiments, and how did that impact or not impact the results?
Well, first of all, people are not aware. There's a cover story. There's always a cover story about what the study is about, and it's not about. It's not. It might be. We might be saying we're interested in personality and memory or something that is a cover story.
But you do tell them it does relate to memory. They know that.
Well, they might know that, but then at the end we have to debrief them and tell them what we did to them, and and that's part of the scientific process. But they don't know going into this that this is a study of false memories. It would defeat the purpose. I mean, these are studies that require you to have some deception in order to get the phenomenon to reveal itself.
What is their reaction when you brief them at the end and you tell them that you plant and they're now recalling things that didn't happen?
Well, they say all kinds of things. Sometimes they say, "Oh, whatever," you know. I mean, but sometimes they get really fascinated and they want to take some psychology courses, or sometimes they'll say, "Gee, I can sort of visualize it. This is really weird," and we, of course, don't know what happens to them a week later unless that's built into the study, because after the debriefing, we don't see them anymore.
Right. Go ahead.
I'm Les Taylor, no particular expertise of any kind. In your talk, you always implied less than 100% bought into the false memories. What distinguished the people who didn't buy into them from the people who did?
Well, we've done a number of studies of individual differences. Which type of people are more susceptible, if any, to these kinds of contaminations of their autobiographies? And one thing we know is, for example, young children are more susceptible than older children or adults to these kinds of influences. We also know from studies that if you score high on standard tests of intelligence, you're somewhat more resistant to these influences. But the correlations, while statistically significant, might be on the order of 0.3 or 0.35. I mean, so even very intelligent people can fall for suggestion and develop a false memory. So there are cognitive and personality variables and demographic variables that are associated with somewhat greater susceptibility. But I would then, point to that study that I talked about in the main part of the talk of the highly superior autobiographical memory subjects who, if anyone, should have been immune, but they weren't.
Yes, ma'am.
Sure. My name is Martha Stevenson, and likewise, no background in this area, but I was curious about the differences between perception and false memories, and people going through the same experience and how they experience an instance differently versus planting false memories, and if you've looked at that in any way, and I'm sure for anyone who's married in the audience, this is certainly something that comes up quite a bit.
Yes, I remember it well. Right?
So perception and memory. Actually, we in the memory field sort of divide the memory process into three major stages. First, there's the acquisition stage, where bits and pieces of experience are stored in the mind. And maybe that's where perception can come into play. And if you have certain biases or prejudices, you can perceive things differently, and those bits and pieces can be stored differently. Then the later stages of retention and retrieval can also be influenced by, your biases and your interests. But we kind of think of the sort of perception and memory as sort of all part of this process of storing information and then trying to retrieve it later when you need to use it for some purpose.
Yes, ma'am.
My question is about the reverse, whether you have done any research on, let's say, a child who has been the victim of false memories imposed by a therapist, like the McMartin preschool case, what can one do then once there's this consciousness? Can you retrieve that child back to reality? Have you done any work in this field?
That actually, I did work on the McMartin case, and
Right.
Oh, boy.
those kids were really led through the most horrific, suggestive questioning to come to believe that all these horrible things happened to them at their preschool. And I think that their memories probably got reinforced and maintained when the families filed civil suits and collected judgments and so on. It's a little hard to take it back. But we have learned something from the hundreds of retractors that these are people who went into therapy, ended up getting these memories of horrific abuse, eventually coming to realize the memories are false. And so how does that happen? I'm not so sure I know about how to bring the kids back, but how does that happen? And a lot of different things are going on, but one of them is that their insurance runs out. And so they're no longer able to continue to see the therapist who is constantly reinforcing this belief system, and they start to say, wait a minute, and then they start to doubt it. So I think putting somebody in a situation where they can meet other people who went through something similar but came out of it, I mean, that might be one way to do that.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, hello. My name is Kenneth Rothschild. At the essence of what you're talking about, basically, it's an example of how the human brain can be manipulated. Now, in our day and age, with advertising in politics, in education and religion, all those sorts of impingements on our mind, probably more than any time in history, continuously. How do we know if there's anything left, and I don't mean this as a joke, of really the ability of the individual to think through, both as an individual and to do it collectively, if there's so much contamination of the mental environment? How do we know whether we're not dysfunctional because of all the impingement?
Well, I think we probably have a lot more fiction in our minds than we'd like to think. But mostly it doesn't matter. It doesn't really matter if I tell you that, I had hamburger last night instead of chicken. I mean, and maybe I really believe it, but it doesn't matter, and you believe me, and I don't get caught in the mistake. When it comes to these legal cases, and when it comes to families or people facing false accusations, then really precise memory does matter, and then it matters a lot.
Let me take the last question here, and then
Bridget
we'll let you run your way.
Scanlon, no background. If we're so clueless, can we use this in a positive way? You mentioned about food and, turning people off certain foods like chocolate. What about alcoholism or other things? Can we use it to, to do things like that?
And I have been asked that question quite a bit. I mean, it's particularly after we showed that you can make people not want to eat fattening foods. You can make them want to eat healthy foods. You can make them think they got sick as a teenager on a vodka drink, and they're not as interested in vodka anymore. So why don't we put this to some good use and let people live a happier and healthier life? And when I suggested this, of course, therapists are not allowed to deliberately deceive you, even if it's for your own good. But publicly, I did suggest there's nothing to stop a parent of an obese or, overweight teenager or child from trying this out on their kids. And when
What's the this? What would they? What?
Plan a little false memory that you got sick on pizza and maybe you won't eat as much and maybe you'll lose some weight. I mean, so of course my enemies came back and said, "Oh, there she goes again. She is advocating that parents lie to their children." Hello, Santa. But a deeper answer is, which would you really rather have? A kid with obesity and diabetes, short heart problems, shortened lifespan, all the things that go with it? Or a kid with a little bit of fiction, a little extra piece of fiction in the memory?
Do you really believe that that would work? Do you really believe that that would change, and has it been demonstrated, the research demonstrated, that a little bit of fiction or planning that memory would prompt that child to eat not just less pizza, but other
Alan
things?
Scaboria, the Canadian, the lead author of the mega-analysis to be published in 2017, did this with peach yogurt. And a month after he planted the false memory that you got sick on peach yogurt, he gave people an opportunity to eat various foods they didn't want as much peach yogurt.
The obese kid isn't eating peach yogurt. No, it's a very interesting thing. I want to ask one final question, and then we'll let you move on. There was an article some time ago, and maybe you read it. Is Google making us stupid? And we think about all the things that we now have direct from our smartphone. And it is my observation in my own life and in others that I remember different things. I don't remember phone numbers anymore because they're all in my speed dial. I don't remember certain account numbers because I don't ever have to enter them because I can now put, or my password, because I can use my thumbprint. Are we rewiring our own brains?
There is a study that was published a few years ago. I'm not sure I'm going to get all the details, but it basically, if you know you can look it up on Google, you don't remember it as well. And so it is, the technology is going to affect the likelihood that we can remember something if we know we don't have to. And I have the same situation with phone numbers. I mean, if I lose my phone, I don't know how to call my brother. So
it's so interesting. Last question. It's a group. We're here in respect and honor of science. This has been your career. This has been your life. For those non-scientists in the room or who are watching, and for those who are here, what's made it amazing to you? What has been the most rewarding part of this process of discovery throughout your life?
Well, I can tell you one of the great moments in the life of an experimental psychologist is when the graduate students come in with the Excel spreadsheets and the graphs, and you get to see what the experiment is showing. And I remember the first of the food studies we did, where we planted a false memory that you got sick eating eggs or pickles, and when people fell for the suggestion, they didn't want the food as much. And I looked at these data and I said, if we could do this with a fattening food, we could be on the brink of a new dieting technique, and that would be a move over Atkins. And so there are kind of amazing moments like that. I like those moments where I get to see what's happening.
Well, we like moments where we get to listen and to learn from you. So thank you, Elizabeth Loftus, and thank you all for your questions. Thank you to the Kavli Foundation and to Carnegie and everybody else. Have a great evening. Safe travels. Thanks again.
Oh, thank you.